Did you know that the most sacred family in the modern history of the Church was not founded by famous theologians or powerful bishops? No, it was founded by a simple watchmaker and a delicate lace maker living in a quiet, humble corner of Normandy. The story of Louis and Zélie Martin is not merely the background or the origin story of their daughter, the great Saint Thérèse of the child Jesus. It is, in its own right, one of the most extraordinary love stories that Christian marriage has ever produced. It is a story where God took two separate lives, two souls who had offered themselves to Him in isolation, and joined them together to create something that neither could have built alone. They created a home where sanctity was the very air they breathed, a sanctuary where 5 daughters found the path that would lead every single one of them to the consecrated life. When Pope Francis canonized Louis and Zélie in 2015, it was simply the Church's official recognition of what their daughter Thérèse had known since she was a little girl, that her parents were truly saints of the Most High. Chapter 1. 2 souls in search of God, frustrated vocations and the hand of providence. Before they ever laid eyes on each other, Louis and Zélie had both tried, with all their hearts, to give themselves entirely to God within the walls of a monastery. But divine providence had other plans. Louis Martin was born on August 22, 1823, in the city of Bordeaux. He was the son of a French army officer, raised in a family of rock-solid faith and austere discipline. From his earliest youth, they passed down to him a deep understanding of the Christian life, one that went far beyond simple, outward rituals. Young Louis possessed a contemplative soul, a natural inclination that led him to seek out silence and prayer with a maturity that stunned those around him. He eventually mastered the craft of the watchmaker, a profession that demanded the same precision, the same patience, and the same quiet focus that defined his very character. He worked with an honesty and a competence that earned him the unwavering respect of everyone in the town of Alençon. However, as skilled as he was, watchmaking was not Louis's ultimate dream. At the age of 22, touched by a grace he described as irresistible, he decided to leave everything behind. He traveled to the great St. Bernard Pass, high in the Swiss Alps, to beg for admission as a monk. For centuries, the monks of St. Bernard had rescued travelers lost in the freezing mountain snows with their famous dogs, living a life that perfectly balanced deep contemplation with heroic service. This was the synthesis Louis craved. But the prior of the monastery had to give him a heartbreaking answer. To be admitted, he had to master Latin, the language of the entire liturgical and academic life of the community, and Louis did not know Latin. Louis returned to Alençon with a disappointed heart, but remarkably, he did not lose his peace. For years, he tried to teach himself Latin, but the progress was agonizingly slow. Eventually, he understood this path was not his path. While many would have seen this as a total failure, Louis accepted it with the serenity of a man who trusts in providence, even when his own dreams crumble. He returned to his clocks and gears in Alençon, enriching his soul with prayer, spiritual reading, and service to the poor, patiently waiting for God to reveal the true map of his life. Now, Zélie Guérin, born 8 years after Louis, in December of 1831, shared that exact same fire for total surrender. But her path and her temperament were very different. She was the daughter of a gendarme and a mother of deep, yet often stern faith. Zélie grew up in an environment marked by financial struggles and the constant moving required by military life. Yet, in the midst of that instability, her interior life grew with an intensity and a depth that was truly rare. As a teenager, she felt the burning desire to become a sister. At 17, she knocked on the doors of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, asking to be received, but the answer she received echoed the rejection Louis had felt in the Alps. The superior told her, clearly and firmly, that God was not calling her to that community. Zélie, who was more impulsive, more passionate than the steady Louis, felt this rejection as a sharp and visible pain. Yet, she too bowed her head to the will of God with fundamental trust. She returned home and mastered the art of Alençon lace, a technique so incredibly delicate, so complex, that it was the pride of the entire region. She began to build her own workshop. This work, which required a monastic level of patience and focus, became for Zélie a hidden path of sanctification, a foreshadowing of the spirit of the Carmel, which her daughter Thérèse would embrace decades later. Chapter 2. The Sacrament from Virginity to Fruitfulness. The meeting of Louis and Zélie was nothing short of miraculous. It happened on the Saint-Léonard Bridge in the spring of 1858. Zélie was crossing the bridge when she saw a man with a serious yet profoundly kind face. In that moment, she felt an internal certainty, a sudden illumination. A voice in her heart said, "This is the man God has prepared for me." Louis, on his part, was struck by this young woman. She had an intense gaze and a seriousness that stood in beautiful contrast to the shallow frivolity of the world. Just 3 months later, on July 13th, 1858, Louis Martin and Zélie Guérin were wed in the Church of Notre Dame at midnight. This was the custom of the time for those of exceptional piety. But what happened in those first months of marriage reveals the unfathomable spiritual depth of these two souls. By mutual agreement, Louis and Zélie decided to live for a time in perfect continence, as brother and sister, offering their married life to God in the most radical way they knew. They wanted to honor the religious life they had both been denied. This lasted for about 10 months, until their confessor, Father Hurel, guided them with great wisdom. He reminded them that the vocation to marriage is a call to paternity and maternity. Their acceptance of this advice, which could have been seen as a step down from their ascetic ideal, was actually the beginning of the most fruitful dimension of their holiness. They realized that by giving themselves to one another, they were co-creating with God and opening the gates for a family of saints to enter the world. God, in his infinite and mysterious wisdom, had closed the gates of the cloister for both of them. But in doing so, he was opening a new door, a door to a fatherhood and motherhood that would bear fruit unlike anything the world had ever seen. The 9 children who would grace their union, 9 souls, 4 of whom would be called back to their Creator in infancy, while 5 would survive to become consecrated religious. These children are the most eloquent sign of the spiritual fecundity of a marriage that had offered itself to the Lord without reservation from the very first moment. Life in the town of Alençon unfolded for Louis and Zélie with a rhythmic regularity, a cadence that was, in its own way, a profound testimony of the holiness that can blossom in the soil of ordinary life. Every morning, without fail, Louis would attend Holy Mass before opening the doors of his watchmaking shop. It was the anchor of his day. Meanwhile, Zélie directed her lace-making workshop with a level of competence that was legendary. Her reputation transcended the borders of Alençon, reaching Paris and other major cities. But when evening fell, the profound work began. The family would gather for common prayer, spiritual reading, and those lively conversations that Zélie described in her letters with such vivacity, making it easy for us to imagine the warmth, the light, and the love of that domestic sanctuary. We are blessed to have over 200 of Zélie's letters preserved today. They are an extraordinary window into the soul of this remarkable woman. They reveal the spiritual atmosphere she breathed into her family, written with a raw spontaneity and a frankness that makes her feel immediately close to us. These letters show a woman living her faith with an intensity and a joy that didn't exclude humor or self-irony. Zélie was no marble statue. She was not a saint from a dusty holy card. She was a woman of flesh and blood, struggling with the pressures of work, the exhaustions of motherhood, and her own perceived imperfections. Yet, it was in the crucible of prayer and the deep love for her family that she found the strength to persevere. Chapter 3. The Workshop and the Watch. Sanctity in the Ordinary. Louis and Zélie did not see their jobs as separate from their faith. They sanctified their professions with the same gravity they brought to their prayers, proving to all of us that the workbench, the counter, and the needle can all be paths to an encounter with the living God. Zélie's lace workshop was among the most prestigious in Alençon, the world's preeminent center for needle lace. Point d'Alençon, considered the finest and most delicate of all French laces, required a level of patience and skill that is almost hard to fathom today. A single piece, just one, could take months of painstaking labor by several artisans, and the price it commanded in the market reflected this perfection. Zélie had mastered this art under a renowned teacher, refining her craft until she reached a mastery that allowed her to open her own business. She led it with a dedication that balanced the highest standards of quality with a deep sense of justice toward her workers. The way Zélie treated her employees was a direct reflection of her spiritual life. In the harsh landscape of 19th century industrial capitalism, her equity and generosity were truly exceptional. She paid just wages. She cared for their personal well-being and their families, often helping them through hardships with a generosity that sometimes left her own pockets empty. The relationship went far beyond mere labor. Years later, several of the women who worked for her would testify that the atmosphere in her workshop was unlike anything they had ever experienced. There was a dignity there, a joy, born from Zélie's unshakable conviction that work well done is, in itself, a way to honor the Creator. Louis, on his part, practiced his trade as a watchmaker with the very same precision and honesty that defined his soul. His reputation in Alençon was flawless. Customers knew that in Louis Martin's shop they would never be deceived, not in the quality of the repair, nor in the price they were charged. In the world of business, then as now, such integrity is a rare treasure. For Louis, this was not just good business. It was a requirement of his faith. He understood that one cannot adore God on Sunday and defraud a neighbor on Monday. This coherence, this unity of life, as Saint Josemaria Escrivá would later call it, was embodied perfectly in the Martin household. As their hard work brought economic prosperity, Louis and Zélie did not use their wealth to simply elevate their own lifestyle. Instead, they directed it toward the service of others. They were known throughout Alençon for their deep charity toward the poor, whom they welcomed regularly into their home. Louis had a habit, a quiet, humble habit, of personally delivering food to the most needy families in the neighborhood, always avoiding any kind of ostentation. Zélie, who managed the family finances with the same brilliance she used to run her business, always set aside a portion of their income for the poor. She didn't see this as a nice gesture. She saw it as a debt of justice owed to those in need. Their apostolic life wasn't limited to material charity. Both Louis and Zélie were active members of various pious associations. They were deeply involved in their parish, and they lived their faith so visibly that their neighbors saw them as a spiritual North Star. They weren't loud or judgmental. They simply lived with such coherence and joy that their silence spoke louder than any sermon ever could. Chapter 4. The family home, a school of holiness. The Martin home, first in Alençon and later in Lisieux, was a place where faith was as natural as breathing. and where sanctity was learned in the small details of every day. The home Louis and Zélie built was a sanctuary where the supernatural and the natural were woven together in perfect harmony. It was not a rigid or cold home, marked by a piety that sucked the joy out of life. No, it was a warm home, a place where prayer and laughter sat at the same table. The demands of the Christian life were presented as something beautiful, something desirable, rather than a heavy burden. The love between parents and children was expressed with a tenderness that Saint Thérèse, the little flower, would later describe as the most formative experience of her entire childhood. The rhythm of the day was anchored in prayer, not a prayer imposed by force, but one lived from the heart. Daily Mass, where Louis would take his daughters from a very young age, was the beating heart of their existence, the center of their world. The family rosary, prayed together in the soft glow of the evening, was far more than a mere ritual. For the Martin children, it was a moment of profound communion, a time they associated not with the weight of obligation, but with the warmth and safety of the family hearth. As the beads slipped through their fingers, the rhythm of the prayers became the heartbeat of the home. During these evenings, Louis would take up the great texts of the Christian tradition, reading aloud with a voice full of reverence. Even as small children, his daughters were immersed in the wisdom of the masters, drinking in the spiritual heritage of the Church as if it were their daily bread. Throughout the house, sacred images and icons served as constant reminders, silent witnesses to a fundamental truth, that God was not a distant judge, but the most cherished guest in their domestic sanctuary. The way Louis and Zélie spoke of the faith was perhaps the most striking element of their family pedagogy. They avoided the dry, abstract language of moralism. Instead, they spoke of God as someone truly present in the room, of the saints as if they were intimate family friends, and of eternal life as a concrete, beautiful destination. Just over the horizon, this vividness of language, which mirrored the vividness of their own souls, allowed their daughters to breathe in Christianity, not as a rigid system of ideas, but as a living relationship. Decades later, Thérèse would capture this spiritual inheritance with a precision that reveals just how deeply she had absorbed her parents' heart. She famously wrote, "God cannot inspire desires that are unattainable. I can then, in spite of my littleness, aspire to holiness." On Sunday afternoons, Louis would lead his daughters on long excursions into the emerald fields and whispering woods surrounding Alençon. And later, Lisieux. Louis cultivated a spiritual dimension in these moments, teaching his girls to read the book of nature. To him, the unfolding of a flower or the majesty of a sunset was an opportunity to speak of the beauty of the Creator, visible in his handiwork. Thérèse would treasure these golden hours with her father as the happiest of her childhood. It was here, in the great cathedral of the outdoors, that she learned to find God in the small, the ordinary, and the humble things of the earth. The bond between Louis and his daughters, especially with Thérèse, his little queen, was marked by a tenderness that was as deep as it was demanding. When Louis called her his Reynita, his little queen, he was doing more than using a pet name. He was providing her with the most tangible expression of the love of God the Father. Thérèse projected onto her Heavenly Father the same unconditional love she felt from her earthly father. This psychological bridge, this sacred transfer, became the bedrock of her theology, her way of spiritual childhood, which has transformed millions of lives, was born from the experience of being the cherished daughter of Louis Martin. Chapter 5. The crosses of the family, the children in heaven. The agony of losing 4 children in their infancy did not shatter the faith of Louis and Zélie. It purified it. It deepened it beyond human measure. Of the 9 children born to the Martins, 4 were taken by death before they could truly begin their lives on earth. 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging from mere infants to a 5-year-old. In an era before modern medicine, such losses were tragically common, yet no less devastating. Louis and Zélie were forced to walk through the valley of the shadow of death repeatedly, facing the ultimate trial of the human heart, the loss of those they loved most, who had barely begun to breathe. The letters Zélie wrote during these seasons of grief are among the most moving documents in the history of the saints. They reveal a spiritual depth that no biography could fully capture. She does not write as a woman who is numb to pain. She writes as a mother whose heart is pierced. Yet, in her faith, she finds a supernatural resource that does not erase the suffering, but gives it a divine purpose. After the death of her little Joseph, she wrote these shattering words, "My heart is split in two, but I recognize that the Lord is the master of what he had given me, and he had the right to take it back whenever he wished." This posture towards suffering, combining raw, honest pain with an unwavering trust in God's loving sovereignty, is the mark of a mature faith. Zélie did not hide behind empty, pious clichés. She stared directly into the darkness, knowing that God was present even in the silence of the grave. Faith, for her, did not promise an absence of trials, but the constant company of the Savior within them. This was the inheritance she passed to her daughters, the root of Thérèse's own spirituality of total abandonment. Louis, more reserved by nature, carried his grief in a different, quieter way. Those who knew him remembered that after each loss, his life of prayer intensified. He would spend longer hours in the shadow of the sanctuary, seeking the silence of the church. This response, turning inward to the heart of God when the world felt empty, reveals a man for whom the divine was the only anchor that could not be moved. The way they spoke to their surviving daughters about their siblings in heaven was also revolutionary. They did not hide the dead in a shroud of fearful silence. Instead, they presented them as vibrant members of the family who had simply arrived at the Father's house first, interceding for those still on the journey. By integrating death into their vision of eternal life, they gave their children a serene relationship with the great beyond, a trait that would later define Thérèse's own transition into eternity. Chapter 6. The Illness and Death of Zélie, the Farewell of 1877. The death of Zélie at the age of 45 was the trial that would transform the Martin family forever. It began in 1865, when Zélie first noticed a small, hard lump in her breast. The doctors of the time could not provide a clear diagnosis. For years, the tumor grew, slowly and silently, as Zélie remained absorbed in the relentless demands of her lace-making workshop, the needs of her children, and a spiritual life that left no room for self-pity or preoccupation with her own health. It was only in the year 1876, when the physical pain became truly unbearable and her symptoms grew increasingly alarming, that Zélie finally decided to consult physicians in a more systematic way. The diagnosis that followed was devastating: advanced breast cancer, a condition for which the medicine of the 19th century offered no effective treatment, no hope for a cure, and no escape from the inevitable. Zélie faced the news of her terminal illness with the same serenity she had shown during every other trial of her life. Yet she did so without denying the harsh reality of her situation, or pretending to possess a peace that would have been artificial. Her letters from this period possess a heart-wrenching authenticity. She speaks of her physical suffering without any sense of drama, yet she never minimizes its weight. She expressed her deep maternal sadness at the prospect of leaving her young daughters without a mother, and yet, in the very same breath, she manifested a trust in divine providence that did not waver even as death drew near. "I am at peace," she wrote just months before her passing, "but I cannot say that I am glad to leave my children. What consoles me is the thought that the good God will take care of them, far better than I ever could. During the final months of her suffering, Zélie undertook one last pilgrimage to Lourdes, hoping for a miraculous healing. This journey, which Louis organized with the stoic devotion of a husband who would leave no stone unturned to save his wife, did not produce the physical miracle they sought, but for Zélie, it held a profound spiritual significance. She returned from Lourdes without the health she had prayed for, but with an inner peace that her daughters would later describe as more luminous than at any other period of her life. Our Lady had not granted her request for healing, but instead, she had given her something Zélie considered far more precious, the strength to live the final months of her agony with a serenity that was, in itself, a miraculous testimony of faith for her entire family. Zélie Martin passed away on August 28, 1877, after months of suffering offered with a patience that astonished everyone who attended to her. She was only 45 years old. At her bedside in that final moment stood Louis and their 5 daughters. The eldest was only 16, and the youngest, little Thérèse, was a mere 4.5 years old. The scene of that final farewell, which Thérèse would describe decades later in her autobiography with a precision that reveals how deeply it had scarred her soul, was lived by Louis with a grief that contemporaries described as the greatest sorrow they had ever witnessed in a man. But even in that darkest hour, according to the testimonies of his daughters, Louis did not lose his faith, nor the fundamental peace he had built over a lifetime of prayer. The death of Zélie marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Martin family, defined by an absence that no human presence could ever hope to fill. Thérèse, too small to fully comprehend the finality of what had occurred, experienced the loss of her mother as a deep wound, a trauma she later described as the first act of her life, marked by a sensitivity and a fragility that would only be healed when she finally entered the Carmel. Louis, suddenly finding himself alone with 5 daughters ranging from 4 to 16 years old, accepted the double responsibility of being both father and mother. He did so with a dedication that his daughters would forever recognize as one of the greatest testimonies of love they had ever received. Chapter 7. Louis the Widower, the father who raised 5 saints, standing alone before the monumental task of raising his daughters. Louis revealed a dimension of his paternity that no other period of his life had shown with such clarity. The decision Louis Martin made to move to Lisieux after Zélie's death was driven by practical necessity, but also by spiritual wisdom. In Lisieux lived Zélie's sister, Isidora Guérin, along with her husband and children. For Louis, the proximity of this family meant his daughters would have feminine role models, a necessary complement to his own fatherly presence. The move took place in November of 1877, barely 3 months after Zélie was laid to rest, marking a truly radical shift in the family's existence. In Lisieux, Louis purchased a home they called Les Buissonnets, a comfortable dwelling surrounded by a quiet garden, which would become the family's sanctuary for the years to come. Thérèse would later recall this house with a tenderness that fills some of the most beautiful pages of her writings. Louis retired from his active work as a watchmaker, entrusting his business affairs to administrators, which allowed him to live comfortably, and he dedicated himself almost entirely to his family. This decision, which in the social climate of the time might have seemed highly unusual for a man of his age and talent, reflected the clarity of his priorities. His daughters were the most precious legacy Zélie had left him, and nothing in this world deserved more of his attention or more of his time. Daily life at Les Buissonnets, under the gentle direction of Louis, was a perfect balance of love and discipline that his daughters would always remember with gratitude. Louis was a tender and attentive father, one who could genuinely enjoy the games and conversations of his children, but he was also a father who maintained the highest principles and the sacred values he wished to instill in them. He was not a permissive father who confused love with a lack of guidance. No, he was a father who combined sweetness with a firmness that his daughters perceived as both consistent and profoundly just. Louis's relationship with his daughters during this time was shaped by a series of conversations and gestures that each girl remembered as decisive moments in her spiritual and vocational growth. When Pauline, the second daughter, revealed her desire to enter the Carmelite convent, Louis responded with a generosity that surprised even those who knew him best. Instead of trying to hold her back or focusing on the sharp pain he undoubtedly felt at the thought of losing another of his daughters to the cloister, he encouraged her to follow the path God was pointing out. He told her again and again that no sacrifice was too great if it was asked by God himself. This was the same holy attitude he would maintain before the vocations of each of his other daughters, including that of Thérèse, whose entry into the Carmel at the age of 15 required of Louis a sacrifice that was uniquely and profoundly painful. Louis personally accompanied Thérèse on her famous pilgrimage to Rome to ask Pope Leo XIII for the authorization to enter the Carmel at such a young age. This journey, which the two of them shared in November of 1887, was for both father and daughter a spiritual experience of immense depth. The image of Louis and Thérèse kneeling before the Pope, the 15-year-old girl pleading with tears in her eyes for permission to give herself to God, and the father at her side, who with his silent presence expressed his total support for that request, remains one of the most moving images in the entire history of this extraordinary family. Chapter 8. The Final Trial. Louis in the Asylum of Caen. The illness that deprived Louis of his reason for 3 long years was the hardest trial of his life and perhaps the most mysterious testament to his sanctity. In July of 1888, only a few months after his little flower, Thérèse, had entered the enclosure of the Carmel, Louis Martin suffered the first of a series of attacks, what we now know as cerebral arteriosclerosis. Over the coming years, this condition would gradually strip away his mental faculties. In the medicine of the 19th century, these attacks were almost impossible to treat and were relentlessly progressive. They produced symptoms that ranged from temporary memory loss to total confusion regarding time and place. There were moments of agitation, moments that his daughters and his brother-in-law, Isidore Guérin, found crushingly difficult to manage. The progression of the disease was merciless. The man of profound serenity and perfect balance, the father his daughters had known as their earthly pillar, was slowly being replaced by a disoriented old man. His suffering was visible to all, and his very dignity seemed compromised by the cruelty of the disease. By February of 1889, the situation reached a breaking point. His daughters and Isidore took a decision that was agonizingly painful, yet they believed it was inevitable for the safety of Louis and the well-being of those who cared for him. He was to be interned at the Asylum of Bon Sauveur in Caen, a religious institution dedicated to the care of those with mental afflictions. When Isidore communicated this to the daughters already within the Carmel, he did so with the greatest delicacy. Yet it was experienced by every one of them as the severest trial of their religious lives. Thérèse, who had always seen in her father the most perfect image of the paternal love of God, now saw that same father deprived of his reason in an asylum. She experienced this trial as a direct participation in the Passion of Christ, a dark night of the soul that would leave an indelible mark upon her spiritual journey. Louis spent 3 years in the Asylum of Bon Sauveur, from 1889 until 1892. During this long exile, those daughters who were able to visit him did so regularly. In every visit, they encountered a man who sometimes did not even recognize them. a man whose agitation contrasted painfully with the peace that had defined his entire life. And yet, the testimonies of those who cared for him at the asylum are not merely stories of decay and sorrow. They are testimonies of a spiritual dignity that the disease could not destroy. In his moments of clarity, Louis would pray with a devotion that astonished the nurses. Even in his darkest hours, his suffering carried a sense of sacred offering, a weight of grace that those around him perceived clearly, though they could not explain it with logic. Thérèse, receiving news of her father's condition through letters from her sisters and her uncle, processed this trial through the lens of redemption. She did not see her father's illness as a scandal or an abandonment by God. No, she saw it as a participation in the agony of Christ, a path to the highest sanctification. The good God who gave me such a father, to represent the goodness of the Heavenly Father, has also willed to give him a halo of martyrdom, she wrote. She used the word martyrdom, not in the sense of a violent death, but as a suffering offered with profound love that purifies and sanctifies the soul. Louis was finally discharged from Bon Sauveur in May of 1892. His condition had stabilized, though his mind never fully returned to its former strength. He spent his final years in Lisieux, cared for by Marie and Léonie and the Guérin family. He lived in a state of peace that his family described not as recovery, but as the fruit of loving resignation. He had accepted the will of God completely, even in the deepest shadows. On July 29, 1894, surrounded by his beloved daughters, Louis Martin passed into eternity. He was 70 years old. He died with the same serenity that had guided his life, having given his children one final and most profound spiritual lesson. Chapter 9. The Legacy. 5 consecrated daughters and a sainted doctor. The most visible fruit of the sanctity of Louis and Zélie Martin is the lives of their 5 daughters, every one of them a religious sister, and one of them a doctor of the Universal Church. To say that all 5 surviving children of this marriage became religious might sound like a pious exaggeration, but it is a verifiable historical fact, one that continues to stun those who hear it for the first time. Marie, the eldest, entered the Carmel of Lisieux in 1886. Pauline, the second daughter, had already entered that same Carmel in 1882, eventually becoming Mother Agnès of Jesus. Léonie, the third, after several failed attempts elsewhere, finally found her vocation with the Visitandines of Caen, where she professed her vows in 1899. Céline, the fourth, who had stayed by her father's side during his years of illness with exemplary devotion, entered the Carmel in 1894, shortly after Louis's death. And Thérèse, the youngest, the one who entered the Carmel at the tender age of 15. She would die there in 1897, at only 24 years old, leaving behind an autobiography and a spiritual doctrine so powerful that the Church would proclaim her a doctor in 1997. This concentration of vocations in a single home is not a mere statistical curiosity. It is the direct result of the sanctity of Louis and Zélie. Their daughters did not flee to the convent to escape an unhappy home. They did not seek in the cloister what they lacked in the family. No, they entered religious life because in their parents' home they had learned to love God with an intensity that made a total consecration feel like the only natural response. As Thérèse so clearly put it, the good God gave me a father and a mother, more worthy of heaven than of earth. The influence of Louis and Zélie on Thérèse's spirituality goes far beyond simple religious practices. Her little way, which the Church recognizes as one of the most original and fruitful contributions to Christian history, bears the fingerprints of her parents' souls. That filial confidence in God the Father, which is the very heart of Thérèse's doctrine, was rooted in her experience of being loved by an earthly father whose love was unconditional and tender. the joyful acceptance of suffering as a path to holiness, a grace Thérèse lived until her final breath, was the same attitude she had witnessed in her parents as they faced the loss of their children, the trials of their work, and the ultimate shadow of illness. And it is precisely this conviction that holiness is not reserved for the cloisters or the remote deserts, but is fully alive in the ordinary flow of a quiet life. This is exactly what Louis and Zélie Martin proved to the world through their simple existence as a watchmaker and a lacemaker in a small town in Normandy. The recognition of the Church toward Louis and Zélie Martin followed the traditional path of canonization, yet it unfolded with a swiftness that reflects the absolute clarity and the unshakable strength of their reputation for sanctity. They were beatified together by Pope Benedict XVI in Lisieux on October 19, 2008, in a breathtaking ceremony that gathered tens of thousands of the faithful from every corner of the globe. And then, on October 18, 2015, Pope Francis canonized them in Rome during the Synod on the Family. It was a gesture heavy with symbolism, the very first spouses to be canonized together in the long history of the Church, received their definitive recognition precisely as the Church reflected deeply on the sacred nature of marriage and the family unit. Chapter 10. The first spouses canonized together, a reflection on the sacrament of Christian marriage. The canonization of Louis and Zélie Martin is perhaps the most powerful message the Church has delivered in recent times regarding the holiness possible within the bond of marriage. The decision of Pope Francis was no mere coincidence. In the modern world, where the Church was grappling with the immense challenges facing the family, the proclamation of their sanctity was the most eloquent argument possible. It proved once and for all that Christian marriage is not a second-class path for those who lack the courage to embrace religious life. No, it is a full and demanding vocation, a high calling that can lead a soul to the very peak of spiritual perfection. The sanctity of Louis and Zélie did not consist of extraordinary miracles during their lives, but of an extraordinary fidelity to ordinary circumstances. They were a humble horologist and a diligent lacemaker, living in a provincial town. They worked with total honesty. They raised their children with a fervent love and a deep-rooted faith. And they faced the crushing weight of sorrow and loss without ever losing their trust in divine providence. They lived their marriage as the Church has always taught it should be lived, as a sacrament, a visible, breathing sign of Christ's own love for his Church. This ordinary holiness, which required no spectacular signs to manifest itself, is precisely why they are so relevant to us today, for the millions of believers who seek in the gospel not an escape from reality, but a way to live that reality with eternal depth. The marriage of Louis and Zélie also offers a profound answer to one of the most urgent challenges of our modern age, the challenge of perseverance in love. In a world where divorce is common, where long-term commitments are often viewed with skepticism, and where a throwaway culture threatens even the most intimate bonds, the story of Louis and Zélie stands as a monument to a love that grew with time. It did not deteriorate, it deepened. When faced with trials, it did not break, it became unbreakable. They found in their shared faith a spiritual wellspring that no crisis could ever drain dry. They were not perfect people. They faced the same tensions and difficulties as any other couple, but they chose, every single day, to remain faithful. And it was this daily, quiet choice that transformed their love into a model for the entire world, for the families of today, who face pressures from every side that make it difficult to keep the home a sanctuary of faith. The example of the Martin family offers concrete and accessible inspiration. They were not a privileged couple living in ideal conditions. They knew the sting of poverty and the responsibilities of prosperity. They knew the pure joy of seeing their children grow and the agony of burying them. They knew health and they knew the slow decline of terminal illness. They knew life together and the final painful separation of death, and in every one of those moments, they found in God the foundation that no storm could ever wash away. A prayer to Saint Louis and Saint Zélie Martin. O holy spouses! Saint Louis and Saint Zélie Martin, the first couple to be canonized together by the Holy Mother Church. We turn to you with the absolute confidence of those who recognize in your marriage one of the most beautiful testimonies of what Christian love can truly become. You, who met upon a bridge in Alençon and built together a home that became a school of sanctity for 5 daughters, intercede for all marriages and for all the families of our time. Obtain for us the grace to live our marital love with the same depth and the same unchanging fidelity with which you lived yours. Help us to learn, as you did, to place Almighty God at the very center of our family life, to make prayer the foundation of our relationships, and to pass on to our children a faith that is a living reality and not merely a tradition of the past. Saint Zélie, intercede especially for all mothers who must balance the demands of work while nurturing their families, those who struggle to find peace amidst the chaos of a busy home. May they find in your example the inspiration to sanctify every task, whether great or small, offering it all to God with a heart full of love. Saint Louis, intercede for all fathers, especially those who face the heavy responsibility of providing for and raising their children in times of hardship or solitude. May they find in your example the strength to remain faithful to their mission as fathers, even in the darkest of trials, trusting that God watches over what we ourselves cannot control. Holy Louis and Zélie, you who experienced the shattering pain of losing your children and the long suffering of illness, intercede for all families going through similar trials today. May they find in your story the certainty that God's love never abandons us in the darkness, and that fidelity in suffering is itself a form of holiness that the Lord recognizes and richly rewards. Guide us by your powerful intercession along the path of marital and family sanctity, so that one day we may be reunited with you and with all the saints in eternal glory, where the love we have begun here on earth shall have no end. Amen.